Stanford University.
And now, please welcome Dean for Religious Life, Scotty McLennan.
Good evening. And welcome to the Stanford Memorial Church for our second annual Harry's Last Lecture. I'm Scotty McLennan, Dean for Religious Life, and I welcome you on behalf of all members of the Office for Religious Life. We're honored and thrilled that Secretary George Shultz is our second Rathbun Visiting Fellow, following Justice Sandra Day O'Connor last year, and that he will be delivering tonight's lecture. As many of you know, his association with Stanford as a faculty member goes back to the 1970s. The Harry and Amelia Rathbun Fund for Exploring What Leads to a Meaningful Life was made possible by an endowment established in 2006 by the Foundation for Global Community, which is directed by their son, Richard Rathbun. Its purpose is to help Stanford students engage in self-reflection, moral inquiry, and exploration of life's purpose, especially in commitment to the common good. Its foremost activity is the Visiting Fellow program, which brings notable, wise, and experienced persons to campus each year for extended interaction with our students in a variety of contexts, the centerpiece of which is this lecture in Harry Rathbun's honor. After receiving undergraduate and master's degrees in engineering, Harry Rathbun worked in government and private industry positions, developing and manufacturing telegraph and radio transmitters. He became vice president of the Colin B. Kennedy Radio Company before returning to Stanford to receive his law degree. As a beloved law professor here from 1929 until 1959, he also became known university-wide for setting aside his final course lecture in law to talk about the kinds of values and commitments that would lead students to lead a meaningful life as a whole. Harry's last lecture became so popular that it drew students from all over the university, and it was eventually moved to Memorial Auditorium in order to accommodate everyone who wanted to attend. Amelia and Harry were also generous in opening their home weekly to students to discuss ethics, psychology, religion, and they co-founded the Sequoia Seminar here in the Bay Area, which was later known as Creative Initiative, then Beyond War, and finally the Foundation for Global Community, which has established this endowment at Stanford through the Office for Religious Life. Many board members and participants in the foundation and predecessor organizations are here tonight, and I want to especially greet and thank you. The Office for Religious Life is committed in its mission not only to guide, nurture, and enhance spiritual, religious, and ethical life university-wide at Stanford, but also to engage ourselves and others in the duty to repair the world. Among other things, we strive to challenge bigotry and injustice, wrestle with issues of ethics and values, affirm community through dialogue and interfaith appreciation, and blend intellectual life and the spiritual journey. For example, my associate dean's colleagues, Rabbi Patricia Carlin Newman and Reverend Joanne Sanders, direct programs with titles like What Matters to Me and Why, Sports and Spirituality, and Fellows for Religious Encounter, which are supported by Rathbun funding. The three of us work with a talented and committed staff to whom we are all very grateful. In particular to Na-Sun Cho, who is the program manager for our Rathbun programming and has been responsible for planning and organizing Secretary Shultz's visit. I also want to acknowledge Development Officer Maura McGinnity, who has worked with the foundation from the start to conceptualize this program and has been staying so helpfully involved with it every step of the way. And I want to note with gratitude how busy our visiting Fellow has been and will be with a variety of student events over these 3 days of his visit on topics ranging from personal origins and multiple future directions in one's career, to maintaining a lifelong commitment to public service, the role of athletics throughout one's life, and diplomacy as both a vocation and a way of being in the world. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Richard Rathbun, who is the president of the Foundation for Global Community, who will make the formal introduction of our visiting fellow. Richard and his sister Juana are both graduates of Stanford. I personally felt immediate rapport with Richard and his Stanford classmate Craig Ritchie, chair of the Stanford Alumni Association Board of Directors, when they first talked to me about the possibility of establishing this endowment. Richard is a social visionary who's put his commitments into practice from his early days in the Peace Corps to groundbreaking work he did with leading the Beyond War organization that has now become the Foundation for Global Community. He's traveled extensively in more than 50 countries and has one of the widest global perspectives I've known. And so it's with the utmost respect and appreciation that I introduce Richard Rathbun.
Thank you, Dean McLennan. To members of my generation, George Shultz doesn't need an introduction. But we could spend hours, if not days, talking about his life and accomplishment. So we won't go into great length about that. Although when I was only 2 years old, he graduated from Princeton with honors. He joined the Marine Corps in 1942 and served through 1945, where he fought and led Marines in the Pacific, and was on his way home with a shipload of his men to retrain for the invasion of Japan when they learned of the dropping of the atomic bombs and the end of the war, which I'm sure was greeted as a mixed blessing. In 1949, he gained a PhD in economics from MIT, and he joined the faculty of MIT, where he taught until 1957. In 1957, he joined the University of Chicago Graduate School of Business and was named dean in 1962. And that represents a period of George Shultz's life, which he calls academia and the world of ideas. And then he was called to public service, serving our nation in positions of public policy. He was Secretary of Labor under President Nixon from 1969 to 1970, Director of the Office of Management and Budget from 1970 to 72 under President Nixon, Secretary of the Treasury from 72 to 74, again under President Nixon, and was called back into public service after under the presidency of Ronald Reagan after Alexander Haig resigned as Secretary of State. He served as Secretary of State to President Reagan from 1982 to 1989, where he was one of the most popular Secretaries of State and one of the longest tenured. He served as Secretary of State during an extraordinary phase of our nation's history, a period that saw an escalation of tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union. And he and the president made a commitment to the goal of negotiating with the Soviet Union to eliminate nuclear weapons. For many at the time, that was an unpopular commitment. They were so successful in that endeavor, in fact, that the process led to an end of the Cold War, a conflict which, for members of my generation, we all remember, had the entire world locked in its deadly grips, the Cold War. And those are all things that George Shultz has done, along with many, many more. We could also speak of his honors and his other achievements, his tenure in business. But this evening is about meaning and purpose. The values and the ideas, some might call them the ideals by which we create a compass for our lives. And that brings us into a more personal relationship with our speaker this evening. This evening is about who George Shultz is. I've had the privilege of spending time in a number of settings with George Shultz over the past 2 days. I have become acquainted with a fascinating and highly accomplished and truly authentic human being. Authenticity is that precious human condition encountered when a person is, above all and in the end, true to themselves, true to their own values and beliefs. And George Shultz is that. He is also a listener, and he's a learner. The fact that he has accepted this challenge to speak tonight and to take on this fellowship, and the questions to which he is being subjected daily, by his own admission, move him somewhat out of what we might call the comfort zone. And he has taken that step boldly. And at 88 years of age, you might expect somebody to settle back and accept the status quo. But the fact that he's here to talk to us tonight about this subject says that George Shultz is continuing to learn. He's a teacher and a wonderful storyteller. If you ask him a question, he will tell you a story. So this evening we sit at the feet of a master to listen and to learn. He may not use the exact words, purpose, and meaning, but when we listen, we will hear a messenger who is himself the message. And that is a great gift. So please join me in welcoming our speaker this evening, George Shultz.
Thank you, Bob. What a crowd. What a crowd. How'd you all get here anyway? I'm amazed how many people have shown up, and of course I am very flattered. And I'm enjoying spending all day with Stanford students, answering questions, telling stories. But when you're on the spot in front of all these bright kids for all day long, you know it's tiring. There, it's sensational. Well, I thought to myself, what could I talk about in a lecture like this? And I remembered the business school students asked me to give a last lecture once, and I talked about how to succeed in negotiations. And I thought, well, that's not good for this. Got to do better. And then I dug around, and I found this quotation from one of Harry's last lectures. He asked all of us as enlightened adults to see things as they are, the is. At the same time, we strive to overcome the shackles of ego in order to be loyal instead to a much larger vision of ultimacy and wholeness, the ought. So I thought I would entitle my talk, The Power of the Ought. The idea that you have a vision out there, a place you should go, and how powerful that is in getting you there. Now, just to start off, think of Stanford's own Tiger Woods. He's there on the 18th green of the Augusta National Golf Club. It's Sunday, the last day of the Masters tournament. His ball is about 25 feet from the cup. Anyone can see at a glance that the ball is going to break and that the green is very fast. So if he hits it just right and it goes in the hole, he wins the tournament. If it's a little too hard, it could roll right off the green. And then he might have trouble sinking the putt coming back, and he'd lose the tournament. He can get whatever advice he wants from his caddy, but in the end, he stands alone on the green. He's the guy holding the putter. He hits the ball, and when the ball stops rolling, the result is unambiguous. People love golf for that relentless accountability. And it isn't only in big tournaments, but in ordinary play on a weekend. Everybody plays by those rules. You don't get mulligans, you don't improve your lie in the rough. I guess you don't. If you get caught, you're out of there. Because golf is relentless, and there is an ought. It ought to be that way. For the game to be good, that's the way it ought to be. And in the game of golf, the is right next to the ought. So that's one example. But this principle has wide applicability. We ought to have an economic system where a company and its executives are accountable for their results. When they blow it, they fail. On a Sunday last fall, before she had to vote in the Senate on that huge bailout bill, our California Senator, Dianne Feinstein, and I had lunch together, and she told me that her office had received over 10,000 phone calls on this subject, and all but 9 of them opposed the bill. In other words, the American people thought about the ought, and they saw the ought going down the drain, and they really didn't like it. It's not popular to bail out the guys that got us in trouble. At the same time, in the end, I think she voted for the bill. Why? Well, because there are other oughts. You ought to be careful that you don't let something happen that winds up with tremendous costs to lots of other people. And so they said systemic risk is involved, and therefore we'll bail them out even though we ought not to. My own opinion is that systemic risk is overrated. And I've had a few experiences in that regard. And that sometimes, at least, it's better to let the organization fail and then use your powers to deal directly with the fallout from it and spend the money there. But at any rate, we've had one bailout after another, and people are very uneasy about it. By now, the federal government is, or it soon will be, a large owner of a huge insurance company, probably 2 automobile companies, and 2 huge banks. That can't help but complicate what ought to be the company's goal. The government's objectives are broader than those of a private enterprise, and different. So we're heading into a situation where, in a great many enterprises, the ought will be a little elusive, and the job of getting close to it will be difficult. I argue for the tremendous importance of the ought, recognition that that causes us to test what is the case and commands us to try to bring it to the right ought. We see this in the struggle in many settings, where sometimes something is done under great pressure, but deviates in important respects from the ought. The internment of ethnic Japanese Americans at the start of World War II is an example. We look back on that. We're not proud of that. Should have looked at these individuals one by one, not make an ethnic decision like that. The use of extraordinary means of interrogation after 9/11 no doubt constitute another. Scientists believe in peer review And they expect experiments to be faithfully conducted and reported accurately. That's the ought. That's what ought to be done. They also know that the ought needs help. So they want to be sure that the experiments can be replicated. If they can't be replicated, then the is not there, but the ought. When I was Secretary of the Treasury, the IRS reported to me, and they were very proud to say that they administered the largest, most successful voluntary system of taxpaying in the world. The voluntarism worked in part, they said, because everyone knows that somebody may be watching. Ronald Reagan kept saying as we negotiated agreements with the Soviet Union, trust but verify. In other words, the job of keeping the is close to the ought needs help. I think of the man who climbed to the roof of his house as floodwaters were rising. A guy comes by with a boat and says, "You better get off now, the waters are rising, you'll drown." And the man said, "No, I'm okay, I have faith in the Lord." So the boat goes away. A little while later, the waters have risen more. Same thing. "Come on, get in the boat." "No, I have faith in the Lord." Waters rose are almost to the rooftop. Helicopter comes and dangles down something for him to grab a hold of. He says, "No, I have faith in the Lord." And pretty soon the floodwaters swept him away. And he said, "Oh Lord, why hast thou forsaken me?" And the voice came down, "I sent 2 boats and a helicopter." So the ought needs help. And you've got to look around for it wherever you are. In 2006, a small group of us gathered at Stanford University's Hoover Institution on the 20th anniversary of the Reykjavik Summit meeting to discuss the potential continuing relevance of the Reagan-Gorbachev vision that was there of a world free of nuclear weapons. A very close friend of mine, and colleague when I was Secretary of State, Max Kampelman, gave a stirring opening speech at that conference. Max spoke of the importance in America of the movement from what is of our present day to the ought to which we aspire, and how that movement has made our democracy the country we cherish today. Our Declaration of Independence, our Constitution, contained many oughts, such as all men are created equal. 1776, are you kidding? It has taken us many years to end slavery, grant voting rights to all our citizens, and to guarantee civil rights, to give a few examples. We're proud of our Declaration of Independence, and we talk about it all the time, and we say all men are created equal. That's the ought. And Max argued that the ought has had huge power. It helped get the is closer to the ought by having it out there. And what he argued was that we should put another ought out there for us, the abolition of nuclear weapons. One of the things that emerged from that essay from that meeting was an essay published in the Wall Street Journal that I co-authored with my colleagues Bill Perry here at Stanford, Henry Kissinger, and Sam Nunn, and many other people signed on, and most particularly a wonderful physicist, Sid Drell, was a moving force in this whole thing. We set forth a vision of a world free of nuclear weapons, and we identified a series of steps that would have to be taken if we were to achieve that goal. We argued, quote, "Without the bold vision, the ought, the actions will not be perceived as fair or urgent. Without the actions, the vision will not be perceived as realistic or possible." So there's an interactive process between the vision and the things you need to do to achieve the vision. For me, the response to our essay was positive, and it was remarkable. Because I remembered when we came home from Reykjavik, I had sat in a little room in Hofty House and a small table about from here to that chair, and not very wide. On one end is sitting President Reagan. On the other end, General Secretary Gorbachev. I'm sitting beside President Reagan. My counterpart, Edward Shevardnadze, is sitting beside President Gorbachev. We sat there for 2 days, and we talked about all kinds of reductions in nuclear arms. We agreed, and this was a first, that human rights would be a recognized, regular, legitimate subject on our agenda. That was a breakthrough. Because the Soviets had always said when we brought up issues like that, it's none of your business. And we talked about the desirability of ending nuclear weapons. I remember when we rode back from the last meeting, which was disappointing in that we didn't finally conclude these momentous things with an agreement, but once things are out on the table, they're there. And I rode back to the ambassador's residence with the president, and I had the job of conducting the press conference. I said, well, Mr. President, what do you want me to say? He said, well, just say everything that happened. So there were no leaks from Reykjavik. Everything was laid out fully. And when I got back to Washington, I was virtually summoned to the British ambassador's residence. Remember Margaret Thatcher used to carry a little handbag, it was a stiff handbag. And I learned that there's a verb in the British language, to be handbagged, you know. And I got handbagged. And she said, George, how could you sit there and allow the president to agree to the idea of a world free of nuclear weapons? I said, but Margaret, he's the president. Yes, but you're supposed to be the one with his feet on the ground. But Margaret, I agree with him. Oh my God. Her reaction was typical. People thought it was an outlandish idea. Now I think there has been a change. People bought into the idea at that time that the idea of massive destruction kept the peace between us and the Soviet Union. But if you were closely involved, as I was, as Bill Perry was, as Sam Nunn was, as Henry Kissinger was, you knew that there were too many close calls. You know you have a few thousand nuclear warheads and intercontinental ballistic missiles, and they're set up to fire within 30 minutes. That is, you get a warning, and that's how long you have to decide whether the warning is right or not, and you want to fire your missiles before they get hit. That's still the case today. It's insane, absolutely insane. But we knew there were too many close calls, and a year or so ago, Henry and Sam Nunn and I were on a panel in Washington. Bill Perry wasn't able to be there. And in the course of it, Henry said, the thing that really bothered me, that caused me to lose sleep, that I agonized over when I was in office, was what would I say if the president ever asked me my advice on whether to use a nuclear weapon, knowing that if one were used, there would be a huge toll. And it would be very likely, almost certain, that there would be a nuclear exchange with all that devastation. Now I think the situation has changed. Many countries have weapons, and additional countries are trying to get them. This means more and more fissile material is around, so the ingredients needed to make a bomb inevitably become more available. As Sam Nunn puts it, he has a wonderful image. He says, think of ourselves as being on the side of a mountain. At the top of the mountain is a world free of nuclear weapons. We can't even see it from where we are, but we know it's there. At the bottom of the mountain is a world where more and more countries get nuclear weapons, where more and more fissile material is around, where the probability rises rapidly that someone will get a nuclear weapon of some kind who isn't interested in deterrent and wants to use it. We're heading down the mountain. We have to turn around and start up the mountain. How do we do that? Well, we identify steps that you can take as you weave your way up the mountain. And when we get along pretty far, we will have done things that make the world safer as we go. Every step will make the world safer. And maybe we get to a base camp where we can look around and see the top of the mountain from there. And then we will figure out the steps needed to get all the way to the top. I might say my colleague Sid Drell, that I mentioned already, has written a brilliant paper on this aspect of the subject. So that's where we ought to be. Where are we now? London, April 1, 2009. Joint statement by President Dmitry Medvedev of the Russian Federation and President Barack Obama of the United States of America, quote, "We committed our two countries to achieving a nuclear weapons-free world." That is a very important, big statement. Because between the United States and Russia, we have over 90% of the nuclear weapons that exist. This statement gains strength from the fact that it builds on a long history. Presidents Eisenhower and Kennedy spoke of this goal. Rajiv Gandhi urged its pursuit with eloquence and urgency before the United Nations General Assembly about 20 years or so ago. I remember, of course, Ronald Reagan's dogged pursuit of this goal. I remember a time in 1984. You remember we had a very tense situation in late 83 and early 84, lots of war talk and whatnot. We sought to defuse it. And you remember after the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, President Jimmy Carter was outraged, and he cut off all our relationships. Our athletes were not permitted to go to the Olympics. Arms control treaty was withdrawn. And the annual visit of Foreign Minister Gromyko of the Soviet Union to Washington, it was a tradition. He always came in September at the time of the General Assembly was canceled. And I remember when I took office, one of my great friends to this day is a man named Helmut Schmidt. He then was chancellor in West Germany. And he came to see me and he said, "George, the situation is dangerous. There is no human contact." Now, when I was Secretary of the Treasury, I had dealt with the Soviet Union, made agreements that were held, had exchanges, did some interesting things. So I set out to rebuild human contact. And we did a few interesting things. People don't know. The first deal we made with the Soviet Union, President Reagan and I did this by ourselves because a lot of people they didn't think we should be talking. Amazing. Was a human rights deal. Do you remember the Pentecostals that rushed into our embassy during the Carter administration? They were still there. And we couldn't expel them because probably they would be killed. And they were, of course, a problem in our embassy. And President Reagan had argued with Ambassador Brennan at a private meeting that I arranged. He said, "This is an eyesore. Everybody can see it's an advertisement of what a lousy way you treat people. And you ought to do something about it." So Dobrynin said to me, well, let's make this our special project. So we did. And finally, we were confident that they would eventually be allowed to emigrate, wouldn't be killed. So we managed to get them out of the embassy. And a couple of months later, they were all allowed to immigrate along with their families, about 60 people. And nobody knew quite happened because the deal was, we'll let them out if you don't crow. So Ronald Reagan never said a word. I thought it must have impressed the Soviet leadership because usually that's the kind of thing the president likes to boast about. And they know that. But the fact that he kept his word might have said to them, you know, you can deal with this guy. If he agrees on something, he'll keep his word. At any rate, as the summer was coming along, we got little indications. One of our diplomats would be at a cocktail party in Vienna, and a Soviet diplomat would come and talk to him. That gave him the idea Gromyko would accept if he were invited to come to Washington. It happened in 3 or 4 places and reported to me. So I saw President Reagan in the summertime for a meeting. He was out here in Los Angeles. Came back. We always had our home here on the Stanford campus, and we came back. And I asked for some private time. I said, well, Mr. President, we have these indications, and I think Gromyko would like to come to Washington, and it would be a terrific thing. But you probably want to think about it because Jimmy Carter stopped that practice because they invaded Afghanistan and they're still there. And he said, I don't have to think about it. Let's get him here. So we did a diplomatic minuet, and Gromyko came. And it was a gigantic meeting, very good meeting. One of the funny highlights that Nancy Reagan loved, and which Dobrynin's memoir says Gromyko went back and enjoyed telling his Politburo comrades about, said, the routine was we'd have a meeting in the Oval Office. Then after that, we'd all go down the colonnade to the mansion and have a lunch. It'd be a working lunch. So Nancy got in touch with me and she said, well, George, I'm the hostess there, and what if I came to the lunch? And I said, well, Nancy, you're the hostess, and I think it'd be terrific if you were there at the reception where we're standing around. And then when it comes time for the working lunch, we'll just go in. So she thought that was a good idea. So we go there, and Gromyko is quick. And he spotted her and immediately ignored everybody else and went over, focused on her. He can be charming if he wanted to be. And he talked to her and he said to her, does your husband want peace? She said, yes. And then he bent down, he whispered in her ear. Then every night before he goes to sleep, whisper in his ear, peace. And Nancy is pretty quick herself, so she pulled him down to her and she said, I'll whisper in your ear, peace. So this provided a little fun, but nevertheless, a certain point of view. Well, after the president won the election, a landslide, it was arranged following the Gromyko meeting that I would meet with him in Geneva to restart the arms control talks. So then on December 20th, I get a call from Ambassador Dobrynin. He says he has an urgent message to the president from General Secretary Chernenko. So I said, well, come right over. A lot of the old-timers in the State Department said, you can't do that. It would take our ambassador in the Soviet Union weeks to get in to see the foreign minister. I said, never mind, he's coming. So Dobrynin likes to play games. He hands me a text in Russian of the letter. So I can play too, so I looked at the letter very carefully, and I said, this is fascinating. And he laughed. He knows I don't read Russian. And he says, well, here's our English translation. So I look at it, and about the third paragraph, it says, "Recently you have spoken on more than one occasion in favor of moving along the road leading eventually to the liquidation of nuclear weapons completely and everywhere." It's interesting. The Soviets had been reading his speeches. The American people were ignoring them. We, of course, welcome that. The Soviet Union, as is known as far back as the dawn of the nuclear age, came out for prohibiting and liquidating such weapons. But even today, it is not yet too late to start practical movement toward this noble objective. So, of course, we were very impressed with that. And I think what that shows, along with the dramatic effort in Reykjavik by Presidents Reagan and Gorbachev to work toward a world free of nuclear weapons. And I noticed, I met with Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov in Moscow a while ago, and I said to him, "Mr. Minister, I read your speeches. And I read one you gave on March 7th in Geneva, and you quoted President Medvedev as saying, 'Today we are facing a pressing need to move further along the road of nuclear disarmament.'" This is Medvedev. "In accordance with his obligations under the Treaty on Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, Russia is fully committed to reaching the goal of a world free from these most deadly weapons." And there has been posted for some weeks on President Obama's White House website the unambiguous statement that, quote, "Obama and Biden will set a goal of a world without nuclear weapons and pursue it." So, first point I want to make, these statements show that the idea of a world free of nuclear weapons, has extraordinary staying power. Why the staying power? I think the answer is that we all know too well that these weapons are unique in their immense and inhumane destructive power, that the consequences of their use are devastating, and that access to nuclear materials is in the process of proliferating. The joint statement by President Medvedev and Obama that I read earlier shows something else, particularly when juxtaposed to many recent statements by leaders in many countries of their support for this goal. And on April 5 in Prague, President Obama followed up powerfully with an ambitious agenda for the United States to lead in taking critical, concrete steps toward a world without nuclear weapons beginning this year. So my second point, this idea not only has staying power, but I think we're entitled to hope and maybe believe that this is an idea whose time has come. So we now must consider ourselves charged with the task of helping bring the vision to reality. What does it take to get from here to there? The ought needs help. The answer is it takes a lot of hard work on many subjects. Of course, major reductions in nuclear arms by Russia and the United States need to lead the way. But more vigorous attention to the proliferation threats from North Korea and Iran must also be on the front burner. In the joint statement and accompanying material, the Russian and US presidents instructed their respective negotiators to get busy immediately to negotiate a follow-on agreement to the START treaty due to expire in December of this year. That's the Strategic Arms Treaty that was negotiated some 15 years ago. Very essential. And that treaty has in it the most detailed verification measures that exist. So preventing its expiration preserves the essence of the treaty's verification measures and the learning that's been acquired by administering them. It's also true that even now, the US stockpile is about 1/4 of its size at the height of the Cold War in 1986. At the time of Reykjavik, it's come way down. Russian numbers have also come down sharply. So my third point is this. Based on the evidence from the past, dramatic progress is possible. This is not an illusion. So how do we proceed? I believe we must go carefully, remembering that we're talking about the national security of each country and of all of us collectively. To turn once again to the Obama White House website, his statement of the goal is followed by a pledge that he, quote, will always maintain a strong deterrent as long as nuclear weapons exist. That is necessary for each country and for the non-nuclear states that depend on the deterrent capability of others. Care does not mean an attitude that time is irrelevant. Time is not on our side. So the key phrase must be careful urgency. And the process needs to advance by taking energetically a series of steps that will pull us back from the nuclear precipice. The agenda is reasonably well known, and it is daunting. Yes, there are steps for the US and Russia to take because of their exceptionally hard arsenals, and I'm glad to see that this process is getting underway. But there are many other necessary actions that involve many other countries, maybe all countries. So it's very important, I think, that this get going, not as a US initiative that we try to get everybody else to sign on to, or even a US-Russia initiative that we try to get people to sign on to, but rather as a global enterprise that we all pitch in on. President Obama, in his stirring address in Prague, identified several of the steps, quote, a new international effort to secure all vulnerable nuclear material around the world within 4 years, and building on our efforts to break up black markets, detect and intercept materials in transit, and use financial tools to disrupt this dangerous trade. Of course, there is the nuclear fuel cycle. It seems likely that we're going to have more and more nuclear power plants. But if that's so, we must get control of the nuclear fuel cycle. Because if you can enrich uranium to the necessary level for fuel for a nuclear power plant, you can enrich it for a weapon. That's the Iranian problem right now. And the spent fuel can be reprocessed into plutonium. My physicist friends tell me that an enriched uranium bomb is much easier to make than a plutonium bomb. But we have to remind ourselves that the Nagasaki bomb was a plutonium bomb. We know that the ability to verify that agreements are kept is essential. A way should be found, for example, to make generally available what is learned from the verification procedures under the START Treaty. And then there are issues of enforcement. What to do? Some country or group steps out of line. As President Obama put it in his Prague speech, quote, rules must be binding, violations must be punished, words must mean something. I think he's right to underline the importance of these words, since enforcement is essential to the desired outcome. The reality is that in recent years, words have not meant much. Security Council statements and declarations by government leaders have been almost routinely ignored, most recently by North Korea's test of a ballistic missile capability. If the threat of proliferation is to be dealt with successfully, then violations must be punished. I remember when I enlisted in the United States Marine Corps, World War II, you don't become a Marine, you become a boot. And you get kicked around for 10 weeks in boot camp. And you remember it vividly. And I remember when my drill sergeant handed me my rifle. He said, take care of this rifle. It's your best friend. And remember one thing. Never point this rifle at anybody unless you're willing to pull the trigger. No empty threats. We have to be careful in making all too many empty threats, saying something or other is unacceptable, and then it happens and we don't do anything. When that happens, your words begin to lose their credibility. So if we're not prepared to do something, we shouldn't say anything. And when we say something, we should have figured out what we're going to do to see that we bring it into force. I'll not catalog all of the steps that need to be taken. In the articles that we published in the last couple of years with my colleagues, Bill Perry, Henry Kissinger, and Sam Nunn, we identified many critical steps. All this is by way of establishing an agenda and creating a commitment to its implementation on a global basis. Achieving a world free from the threat of nuclear weapons will require a willingness to be idealistic and realistic at the same time. By combining realism with idealism, we can find a way to, through practical steps, from what is a world with a risk of increasing global disaster to what ought to be a world free from the threat of nuclear weapons. Let me close by saying these goals and the efforts toward them are in keeping with the Rathbun legacy. In fact, many of the conversations, I understand, in their Kellogg Avenue living room seminars were about this very topic. So I'm certain they would be pleased to know that we are here tonight discussing and furthering this issue, and in general, engaging ourselves and others in the Rathbun mission, the sacred duty to repair the world. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary Shultz. And we have an opportunity now for you in the audience to ask questions and engage in some discussion with Secretary Shultz. I ask that you keep your questions brief and to the point, and that they be questions, please, and not statements. And let me start here on the left side of the church with the first question.
Thank you. Two-part question. One is, where do we stand right now, and what are the immediate steps? And the other is, what about nuclear waste? What is being done, and what can we do?
Well, I tried to indicate where we stand, that there is now momentum, and it stems from the statements of the presidents of the two countries that have the vast bulk of nuclear weapons. So I consider that to be very positive. It's also been extraordinary to see the number of important people in different countries, Japan, Germany, Australia, France, Britain. British government has expressed its full support for this, said they want to undertake the process of verification and be the people who try to figure that out, and so on. So I feel that there's a lot of momentum now. And so in our group here, we're trying to be helpful. We continue to develop papers. We had an inquiry from the Chinese government. They wanted to send some people in their nuclear establishment here and try to figure out what are we thinking about. So they came, about 8 of them, and we sat in our conference room, the Annenberg conference room at Hoover, and had very good exchanges with them. And so there's a lot going on. Not that there aren't very skeptical people. On the other hand, most people see that getting to the base camp is desirable, even if they don't like the idea of no nuclear weapons. So at least it gives us a chance to work with people who are skeptics. Nuclear waste is a problem. It's huge in volume. If Yucca Mountain were built and ready to receive spent fuel, the spent fuel that's now in existence would fill it up. It's huge in volume. So I think we have to find other ways to deal with it. You can reprocess it and reuse it, but the French do that and others, but it's, of course, there you're producing plutonium. It's very important that we get control of the nuclear fuel cycle for just the reason that your question indicated. There are also potential technological breakthroughs. I hate to even talk about them because I don't know enough physics to feel good about it, but there's a new machine over at Livermore called the NIF, National Ignition Facility. It's the largest laser in the world. It's just been, well, the commissioning ceremony is going to be later in May. But this machine contains 196 lasers, each one of which is bigger than any laser in the world. And they can so focus them as to create heat on the order of the sun. The national security objective of the machine is to be able to create what amounts to a nuclear explosion without conducting one, so you can study what happens. But having built it, it's clear that there are a lot of breathtaking potential other things. They are confident, and my physicist friends here, they're sort of Yogi Berra types. They say they ain't done it till they've done it. But they're confident that they're going to produce fusion within a couple of years. People have been trying to do that a long time, and they haven't succeeded. They think when they do that, they will be able to create devices that will burn spent fuel or use it directly and get rid of it that way, make use of it. So whether that will happen, I don't know, but there are a lot of things like that out there that we need to keep pursuing. So I think it's a very good question that only underlines this point of getting control of the nuclear fuel cycle.
Is there a question on the right side of the church? You'll see there are mics here at each of the two columns, so please feel free to stand and form a line behind those two mics.
Sir, do you have any religious or spiritual beliefs that underlie this philosophy of yours?
I'm sorry, my ears aren't
Religious
that...
beliefs or spiritual principles which underlie the life you've led?
Principles that underlie the life I've led.
Or religious beliefs?
I'm not a very introspective person, and I've spent all day long with various student groups that he's organized, and they're asking me questions like that. And they're also smart, it scares you. But anyway, about all I can do is tell stories. But there has been a thread as I've thought about it in my life. Ever since I went off active duty in the United States Marine Corps after World War II, I've been affiliated in one way or another with the university. As a student for a PhD, as a member of faculty, as a faculty member on leave, MIT, University of Chicago. Then when I went in the cabinet, I was on leave. When I stopped being Secretary of the Treasury, I got a lot of nice offers, including one from Stanford. He offered me a chair, and the dean was R.J. Miller. I said, R.J., I don't want a chair, I want a couch. Do you have a couch? I didn't have a couch. But I thought to myself, I've been in the university, I've written books and been a dean and done all that, taught. And I've been in government, so why not try business? And I was very fortunate to get an offer from Steve Bechtel at the Bechtel Corporation. And so I came out here, And RJ said, well, you declined to be a full-time professor, how about being a part-time professor? And the Beckles are very Stanford-oriented, and they said, well, that's fine as long as you can fix it up so you don't interrupt your business duties. So I did that, and I had a seminar each quarter, and I'd schedule dates when I knew I was going to be in town, that is, the night, afternoon, and evening before a board meeting and stuff like that. So I had seminars, good students, lots of fun, wrote a book called Economic Policy Beyond the Headlines. So even though I was a full-time businessman, or quadruple-time businessman, I also was a part-time member of the Stanford faculty. And then when I got to be Secretary of State, you have to sell everything and drop everything. And for some reason, the only thing that the government seems to think is okay is if you are a professor on leave. So I was a professor on leave while I was Secretary of State. So all this time I've had that thread, and then when I came back to Stanford, first at the business school and then as an emeritus professor at the Hoover Institution. And I feel that the university is it's the place of ideas. And ideas are sort of a compass for you. And I used ideas a lot in my various offices. So the interplay of ideas and action has been something that I've benefited a lot from. And I feel that my attachment to the university various universities has been very important for me. I used to have a test of things that I could support. Of course, if I agreed with it, I could support it. But if I didn't agree with it, I said to myself, if I can defend this in a university seminar, not that I necessarily get everybody to agree with me, but they agree that I can make a credible defense, then it's okay. But if I feel there's no credible defense that can be made, I just can't go along with it. So once again, kind of the university tradition has been very helpful to me.
Question here on the left side of the church.
We appreciate so much what you have done toward peace and getting nuclear down to zero. I heard a gentleman speak recently, a Robert Gaunt, at the Unitarian Church, who outlined some of the things that we'd have to come up with, global institutions, so that the small countries who may either be thinking of a nuclear weapon or have them, like Israel and maybe North Korea and so on, thinking defensively, that we would need institutions so that these countries would feel there was some global institution that would defend them if another country tried to invade. And I thought that was a pretty important thing, so that they would feel like giving up all their nuclear weapons without having to coerce them, that they would feel there's somebody going to take care of me. Do you have any thoughts on what that would be or what it would take to develop? Because the UN seems not to be ready for that.
I think the point is very well taken, that we have to face up to the fact that there are a lot of simmering disputes around the world. And people don't have disputes because they have weapons because they have disputes. And what can we do about them? It's hard. Take the Kashmir struggle, take the Israeli-Palestinian issue. I think there are things you have to work at. And I use an analogy from the construction business. If you say to me as a construction guy, build me a bridge across the bay. Well, I do my soils test, and I can build the bridge, you can walk across and ride across, problem solved. It's a soluble problem. If you say to me, build that bridge in such a way there are no lost time accidents during the period when you're building it, and I put up guardrails and I do one thing and another and say, I've solved the problem, I've lost. because it's all about attitudes. So if I say to myself, this is an inherently insoluble problem, it's a problem I have to work at. And if I work at it skillfully and persistently and creatively, maybe I can get the bridge built without a lost time accident. Now, I think there are a lot of these problems that just need to have a lot of attention. And don't get the idea that you're going to solve it by the end of the year or something. It's just not in the cards. But if you're paying attention to it, then it keeps it from sliding backwards. And you start making little steps that start to work. I'm very impressed, for example, with the appointment of George Mitchell in the Israeli-Palestinian arena. And George has been impressive in his silence. He has been acquainting himself with people. He's been consulting with people in the State Department and finding good people who are very knowledgeable to be part of his team, organizing first-class team. And he hasn't been around pounding his chest or making statements or anything. So he's a pro. That's what we need. And it'll probably take a while. Maybe it'll never get solved, who knows. But if we're working at it, it gives people some hope. And it keeps the situation from deteriorating. When nothing is being done, it deteriorates. So I think we ought to be doing that, and sometimes take the Northern Ireland situation. It was generally thought, this is impossible, these people will never stop killing each other. And somehow, people kept at it and at it and at it. George Mitchell was actually played a good role here. And finally, it got solved. It's not perfect, but it's much better. So I think your point is well taken, that we have to, as part of this effort, we have to commit ourselves to working on these kinds of issues. And we'll also have to face up to the fact that people are not going to want to have an end to nuclear weapons and have the United States have a gigantic superiority in conventional capability. I think that's going to have to be faced up to. And that's going to be hard for us. But these are some of the difficult things that lie down the road.
At the right hand, Mike.
Thank you. In many situations where the gap between what is and what ought is very big, these problems take a long time to solve. And in public service and in business, we often see that the span of service is very short relative to the size of the problem being solved. So a problem that may take 20 or 30 years to be solved, whereas a CEO or a president or a public servant is only in office for a handful of years, how is someone in that position, in your experience, how have the successful people been able to focus on the big picture goal when their elected term or their term in office is only a very small amount of time relative to that goal, especially when that involves short-term sacrifice to achieve the big picture goal?
That's a good question. And it's a reason why in this nuclear effort, as our group that's been working on this has proceeded, we've tried to make it broad in its appeal. And people have said frequently, isn't it nice it's bipartisan? And we all say, it's not bipartisan. It's nonpartisan. This is a subject of such a nature, it just doesn't lend itself to try to get a partisan advantage out of it. There are plenty of problems. Let's work at them in their own terms. And we were all very pleased, and had something to do with it, that during the last election campaign, candidate Obama endorsed what we're doing, and he referred explicitly to the Wall Street Journal articles that I mentioned. And then in office, he has further gone forward with it. And Senator McCain, the Republican candidate, also endorsed what we're doing. He made a wonderful speech during the campaign, and his speech began, "Ronald Reagan had a dream of a world free of nuclear weapons, and I share that dream." So Senator McCain has already spoken up in support of what President Obama is doing, and I hope there'll be some occasion before long where they can sit together, and that would help to get it out of the partisan nature and focus on the problem and set up something that will last. So I think that if you can get the subjects into the right frame, they can go. There's a lot of continuity. For instance, Bill Perry asked me to come to a class that he had a while ago, and somebody said, "Well, what about continuity? Just your question." And I said, "You know, when Bill Perry was Undersecretary of Defense, he developed some weapon systems. And when you look at the Reagan buildup, what was built up? It was the weapon systems that Bill had produced. And we felt that you had to have strength in order to attain peace. And eventually, President Reagan I was able to negotiate some arms control agreements. And then Bill Perry comes in as Secretary of Defense, and I remember pictures of him destroying silos in the Soviet Union pursuant to the agreements that we had negotiated. So as Bill and I have talked about our careers, there's been a lot of continuity, more than you might think. And if you can conduct things in such a way that there's broad appeal, particularly on an issue like this, I think you have a chance of staying power. I can give an example. I've gotten a lot of awards. The one that I really like the most is totally unknown, really. But on the next to last day I was in office, the Senate of the United States gave a luncheon for me. It was organized by Dick Lugar, Republican, and Ted Kennedy, a Democrat. And the meeting was chaired by Bob Dole, the Republican leader, and George Mitchell, the Democratic leader. And they gave me a little award. But it was a mutual congratulations society because as we went along, I had consulted with them constantly, not just in hearings, but in individual sessions and small informal sessions, and in many other ways. So I had learned from them. They had been involved with what I was doing. They had a Senate observer group that went to Geneva. And I learned, if you want me in on the landing, you better include me in the takeoff. So that's the way we worked. And we had very few partisan arguments in the foreign affairs field when I was in office, and I think that's the case. We started a tradition. There's been one at the Treasury for a long while. I was the beneficiary of it when I became secretary. The tradition is that the former secretaries give a dinner for the new secretary. Invite the president, the vice president, in the Treasury case, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, former chairman, and the chairman and ranking member of all the committees of Congress that you deal with. And so there are Democrats and Republicans there. And the whole point of the dinner is to say, a huge proportion of what you do is basically professional work. And we're all proud of the Treasury. So we're all here to let you know we're ready to help you, ready to give a backboard for anything you want to talk about. So I thought we ought to start something like that in the State Department. And so we had a dinner for Condi. Everybody came. Even Joe Biden was warm and cuddly. And there was one moving moment. I started off, and then various people talked. And then toward the end came the late Tom Lantis. And he said, there've been a lot of nice things said about Condi here, but in our family, it's different. We love her. Let me explain why. He said, I have a granddaughter who's the most beautiful young girl in the world. Most grandfathers think that. And she's also blessed with an operatic quality voice. And we learned recently that she has a disease that probably will rob her of that voice, and maybe worse. And Condi found out about this. And she went to my granddaughter and she said, why don't you and I give a concert at the Kennedy Center? So they got together, they picked out what they wanted to do, they practiced 4 or 5 times, and they gave this concert. And it was the most wonderful thing that's ever happened to my granddaughter, he said. So in another month, we're giving a dinner for Hillary Clinton. Same idea. Same cast of characters will come. So I guess my answer to your question is, yes, there's a term when people are there. But in many areas, there's also a spirit of passing the baton and trying to be helpful to your successor, feeling that if your successor does well, that's great.
The mic on the left.
So during your distinguished service in public office, you have interacted on and off the stage with various world leaders. And I'm curious about an incident that might have surprised you in terms of an uplifting moment when a world leader surprised you, and an alternative one which surprised you in the negative direction, and what were the consequences to the world as a result of these two possibilities?
I couldn't get that, Scotty.
Something that surprised you, both in a negative way, an incident like that, and one that surprised you in a positive way when you were engaged in your work as Secretary of State.
Well, Henry Kissinger was once asked as he was leaving office to say what his best things were and what his failures were, and he said, I don't understand the last half of the question. But let me talk about it, not really a surprise, but something that you work at things, and sometimes it seems hopeless, but you keep working. And the Reagan Administration and President Reagan was a big advocate of human rights, of human freedom. It was on his mind all the time. And we worried a lot about people in the Soviet Union who were not allowed to worship as they chose, who were not allowed to emigrate. And we worked on it a lot. I worked on it a lot. Whenever I went to Moscow, I'd meet with refuseniks and try to buck them up. Sometimes you have the reverse. We had a Seder in our embassy in ambassador's residence at one time that I went to. And the idea was I was going to go and I was going to buck these people up. They were being repressed and so on. And as soon as I went, I saw it's all the other way around. You meet human beings who have the strength of conviction, and even the powerful Soviet state can't do anything about it. And it's inspiring. But you work on it and you don't seem to get anywhere. And then finally we worked on it very hard, a lot of things, and finally we broke through. So I won't say it was a surprise because I've been working at it, but not until we really broke through did we see that it was really happening. And sometimes people ask me what did I feel best about? This is the end of the Cold War, or this or that. And I said, well, for me it has a human face. And there was a refusenik in the Soviet Union named Ida Nudel. And I had met with her whenever I went to Moscow. I'd met with her sister. And seemed hopeless. But anyway, we kept at it and at it and at it. And one day I got notice that I was going to get an important phone call at 3 o'clock in the afternoon in my office, so the phone rings. And on the phone is this voice. It says, "This is Ida Nudel. I'm in Jerusalem. I'm home." So for me, that's thrilling.
On the right, please.
So one thing that you talked about was controlling the access of countries to enrich uranium. And the one specific case that I wanted to ask you about was the case of India. So one of the important decisions taken by the Bush administration was to give India access to a lot of US civilian nuclear technology. And I mean, there are a lot of conflicting views on this, but I just wanted to know what your opinions were on this decision.
Well, it was one of these close issues, and it gave a problem to the so-called nuclear suppliers group, on the one hand. On the other hand, it was beginning to draw India into the system a little bit more. So you could argue it either way. But it's a done deal now. And what I think is, if we can get really going on a world free of nuclear weapons, and India is in favor of it. Of course, they want to be sure Pakistan is taken care of as well. But if we can get everything into that framework, then a lot of things will fall into place more easily. And India's participation in the Non-Proliferation Treaty would be one of them, I hope. But that's down the road some. I do think, more broadly, what needs to be done in the nuclear fuel cycle is to have an internationalizing of it. Obviously, enrichment plants are located somewhere. Many of them have multinational ownership, which is good. But if they are internationalized, then we would expect there to be not just a kind of a supervisory function, but the programs that I've seen envisage international operators in the plants, so you really know what's going on. And you can feel confident that they're not enriching to weapons grade. And then you have to have some way of retrieving spent fuel and dealing with it, as an earlier question raised. And my own opinion is that we're not there yet on knowing how to deal with the spent fuel. Somewhat there, but we have a long ways to go.
Libya comes to mind as a recent example of successful disarmament, especially with just generally with weapons of mass destruction. And I wanted to hear your perspectives on what factors you felt like brought that about, and if there are any lessons that might hold for a more general approach with other countries.
Well, I'm not privy to everything, but a lot has become public. There was a fair amount of negotiation going on. Libya had a major program. People knew about it. There was an initiative that's been started that has wide participation. And part of the initiative, they intercepted I think, a North Korean ship that was taking nuclear material to Libya. So Gaddafi could see, in a sense, the jig is up. People know what I'm doing. And he looked over and saw what happened initially in Afghanistan. He saw what happened to Saddam Hussein. And maybe he concluded that he'd be better off without these weapons. I don't know. But it was a good piece of diplomacy, a good piece of intelligence, and a good piece of execution in finding the ship. And in what I read you from President Obama's Prague speech, he identified this kind of activity as something that needs to be emphasized.
Secretary Shultz, I want to thank you for a life well lived, for truly fulfilling what this lecture is meant to be in the Rathbun tradition. But more than that, the extraordinary way that you live in the future. That is, at the age of 88, you're here as a prophet, moving us to a vision of bringing the is and the ought together in one of the most critical areas that will indeed save this planet. And for that, we're all very grateful. Thank you so much.
Let me just add a point. This is an interesting program, and I didn't know quite what to make of it when you came. And I'm going to sit in front of students and talk about my life. What am I going to do? That's not me. But anyway, it's been a terrific day. I've learned a lot from the students. I hope they've learned something from me. They probe you and they push you. And the turnout tonight is extraordinary, and I'm very grateful to all of you for coming and being willing to listen to what I have to say. So thank you very much.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.